This is a comprehensive masterclass. No surface-level content, no quick fixes. A complete immersion into Carl Gustav Jung's most transformative psychological concepts, with one singular purpose: to teach you how to master your shadow and achieve unshakable psychological strength. Who needs to watch this entire course? Anyone experiencing recurring anxiety, unexplained anger, chronic guilt, or emotional patterns they cannot break. Those who recognize they're trapped in cycles of self-sabotage, despite their best conscious efforts. People who feel controlled by emotions they don't understand, reactions they can't predict, and impulses that seem to emerge from nowhere. If you carry psychological pain that has no clear origin but affects every area of your life, this course is specifically designed for you. Throughout this comprehensive training, you will gain crystal clear understanding of what Jung called the shadow, the hidden aspects of your personality that drive most of your emotional suffering. You will discover how unconscious complexes secretly orchestrate your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. You will learn why traditional positive thinking fails to create lasting change, and why surface-level self-help cannot access the deeper layers where real transformation occurs. Most importantly, you will master Jung's proven method for psychological integration, a systematic approach that has been validated by over a century of depth psychology. This is not theory for academic discussion. This is practical knowledge that will fundamentally alter how you understand yourself and navigate emotional challenges. This course demands active participation. Pause when concepts feel overwhelming. Take detailed notes. Return to sections that trigger strong reactions. Each principle presented here contains the potential to revolutionize your inner life, but only through genuine application. Passive consumption changes nothing. Personal engagement changes everything. You will understand why shadow repression underlies most psychological disorders, how your social persona contributes to emotional instability, how archetypal forces from the collective unconscious influence your daily experience, and how to transform this knowledge into practical mastery. This represents a complete psychological education, a solid foundation for anyone seeking to begin or advance their individuation process, which Jung identified as the fundamental purpose of human psychological development. If you truly desire freedom from unconscious emotional reactivity, if you want to become someone who can navigate life's most challenging experiences without being overwhelmed, you have found the right resource. But understand this clearly. Only those who complete this entire course and implement these teachings will experience genuine transformation. Let us begin this profound journey into the depths of your psyche, understanding the shadow, the hidden driver of your life. The shadow represents Carl Gustav Jung's name for the collection of everything you have rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge about yourself. This is where our comprehensive training truly begins, understanding what the shadow is and why it wields such devastating influence over your emotional existence. Consider this scenario. From your earliest memories, you received conditioning from parents, educational institutions, and society about what constitutes acceptable behavior. You learned that expressing certain emotions, anger, jealousy, selfishness, fear, resulted in disapproval, punishment, or rejection. Naturally, you adapted by suppressing these aspects and presenting only what garnered positive responses. This suppression process creates what Jung termed the personal shadow. But here lies the crucial misunderstanding. Repressed psychological material does not disappear. Instead, it accumulates in the unconscious, gaining autonomous power and secretly influencing your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The shadow encompasses all denied aspects of personality, the parts you consider unacceptable, immoral, or incompatible with your self-image. Anxiety often represents indirect shadow manifestation. Depression frequently results from accumulated emotional energy trapped in unconscious darkness. Explosive anger emerges when repressed material can no longer be contained. Self-destructive behavior occurs when the shadow attacks your conscious goals from within. The shadow is not inherently malevolent. It contains aspects that could become sources of strength, creativity, and authentic power if properly integrated. However, as long as it remains unconscious, the shadow operates autonomously, creating the emotional chaos that characterizes most people's inner lives. This explains why intelligent, well-intentioned individuals find themselves trapped in repetitive cycles of emotional suffering they cannot rationally explain. They experience overwhelming reactions, self-sabotaging impulses, and behavioral patterns that contradict their conscious values and goals. Here is the fundamental truth most people lack the courage to confront. You are not merely the idealized image you have constructed of yourself. You are not only your positive qualities, your admirable traits, your socially acceptable characteristics. You are also everything you fear most about human nature. The more desperately you flee from these aspects, the more psychologically fragile you become. Shadow integration is not about achieving perfection. It is about achieving wholeness. It requires recognizing that anger, envy, fear, and the desire for control are universal human experiences. Only by bringing these aspects into conscious awareness can you prevent them from continuing to sabotage your life from the unconscious realm. In the following section, you will see precisely how the shadow controls your emotional responses and decision-making processes in ways that remain completely invisible to your conscious mind. How the shadow controls your emotions and decisions. Now that you understand the shadow's nature, it is essential to grasp how it impacts your daily life far more directly than you imagine, particularly through your emotions and choices. The shadow is not an abstract psychological concept. It actively shapes your feelings, impulses, and decisions every day. Jung emphasized that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will continue directing our lives while we attribute these influences to fate or external circumstances. This principle is fundamental to understanding why so many emotional reactions seem beyond your control. From early childhood, you learned to suppress certain feelings, rage, envy, terror, selfishness, because expressing them resulted in disapproval or punishment. You developed sophisticated mechanisms for hiding impulses deemed socially unacceptable. However, what gets repressed does not vanish. It remains psychologically active, charged with emotional energy, operating autonomously through shadow dynamics. When you experience anxiety you cannot explain, you are often encountering unrecognized shadow content, seeking expression. Similarly, disproportionate anger responses, profound sadness without apparent cause, or persistent guilt feelings all indicate shadow activity. In Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung warned that repressed contents do not cease existing. They become autonomous forces capable of invading and dominating consciousness unexpectedly. This explains why emotional reactions often feel automatic and uncontrollable. They emerge from unconscious complexes, fragmented aspects of your psyche operating under shadow influence. Your decisions are equally affected by this process. Repeating destructive relationship patterns, sabotaging professional opportunities, or maintaining self-defeating attitudes all stem from unintegrated shadow content. As long as you believe you maintain complete conscious control over your emotions and choices without first confronting your shadow, you are living in dangerous illusion. Your shadow does not diminish through denial or rationalization. It strengthens in darkness and ignorance. However, there is a pathway out of this unconscious control, beginning with recognition and awareness. Learning to identify shadow patterns represents the first step toward reclaiming genuine emotional autonomy and developing authentic psychological resilience. But there exists a fundamental obstacle preventing most people from beginning this crucial work: the persona, your social mask constructed to gain approval, ensure protection, and maintain social acceptance, actually reinforces shadow dominance. Pay close attention to what follows, because if you have progressed this far, you may be wondering how to practically apply this knowledge. Understanding alone creates no change. Transformation requires consistent practice. This is precisely why I developed my comprehensive guide, Shadows to Strength, a 30-day integration journey, not merely an informational resource, but a practical 30-day program featuring simple yet powerful daily exercises, requiring only minutes of daily commitment. You do not need extensive free time. You need consistent dedication. Every exercise is specifically designed to help you connect with unconscious material and begin systematic shadow integration. This guide perfectly complements foundational shadow work by providing the daily practical path for applying theoretical knowledge in real life. It is currently available with a limited time early access discount, but this offer will not continue indefinitely. If you are genuinely committed to this transformative work, do not delay. Access the link in the description and begin your practical integration journey immediately. The persona, your social mask, and its hidden costs. To understand how the shadow maintains control over your psychological life, you must comprehend the persona's role, the social mask you have constructed to survive and adapt to external world demands. Jung described the persona as a system of adaptation or relationship with the external environment. Essentially, the image you present to gain acceptance, respect, or affection. The persona is not your authentic self. It is who you have learned to appear to be for social survival. From childhood, you observed that certain behaviors generated approval, while others led to rejection or punishment. Naturally, you emphasized pleasing aspects while concealing those that were not. Over time, this adaptive strategy crystallizes into a fixed persona, an idealized version of yourself that you carry into relationships, professional environments, and social interactions. Here lies the fundamental problem. Everything you repress to maintain this acceptable mask gets pushed into the shadow. The more rigid and perfect your persona becomes, the more psychological material accumulates in unconscious darkness. Therefore, individuals who appear extremely controlled, perpetually positive, and publicly impeccable often struggle privately with severe anxiety, depression, explosive anger, or suffocating emptiness. The cost of sustaining an idealized persona is psychologically devastating. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung warns that the persona represents a compromise with society, but also constitutes self-deception, distancing us from our authentic nature. The more completely you identify with your persona, the more disconnected you become from your genuine self. and the more vulnerable you are to shadow manipulation. This internal conflict generates constant emotional exhaustion. You expend tremendous energy maintaining an artificial image, while repressed aspects of your psyche demand attention and expression. This is a psychological battle that cannot be won through willpower alone. The shadow will always find manifestation pathways through physical symptoms, emotional crises, or impulsive behaviors that contradict your conscious intentions. The solution begins with dismantling the mask and recognizing that you are not your persona. You are a complete human being with light and shadow aspects. Integrating these elements represents the only path to genuine emotional freedom. The first step toward integration involves learning to identify your personal shadow elements and recognizing how they manifest in daily life. This is precisely what you will discover in the following section: recognizing your shadow in daily life. Now that you understand the interaction between shadow and persona, it is time for a crucial practical step: learning to recognize your shadow in everyday experiences. Jung made clear that the shadow reveals itself whenever you are dominated by intense and seemingly irrational emotions. In Ion, he writes that the shadow appears through impulsive reactions, behavioral lapses, and projections you make onto others. You do not need to retreat to isolation to discover your shadow. Simply observe your daily reactions with honest attention. Here are specific practical examples. Imagine feeling sudden, disproportionate hatred toward a colleague at work. Something minor, a comment, a gesture, triggers rage that even you consider excessive. This represents clear projection. What you are hating in that person is actually a repressed aspect of yourself that you refuse to acknowledge. Another example, you find yourself judgmentally condemning people who display emotional vulnerability, labeling them as weak or dramatic. If you examine this reaction more deeply, you might recognize that you have suppressed your own sensitivity for years, fearing that others would perceive you as weak. What you condemn in others is what you cannot tolerate recognizing in yourself. Additional manifestations include envying someone's success intensely, feeling excessive guilt over minor mistakes, experiencing outbursts of jealousy, chronic procrastination patterns, or consistently avoiding important confrontations. All of these can represent shadow expressions. In Man and His Symbols, Jung and his collaborators emphasized that dreams provide one of the most direct pathways to shadow content. Recurring dreams featuring loss of control, being pursued, confrontations with dark figures, or aggressive animals typically indicate that repressed material is seeking conscious emergence. Physical symptoms also provide valuable information. Chronic tension, unexplained pain, or persistent fatigue often reflect psychic energy blocked by attempts to keep shadow aspects from conscious awareness. Therefore, the key to shadow recognition is honest self-observation, combined with courage to see what you would prefer to ignore. Ask yourself, what irrationally bothers me in others? What emotions dominate me against my conscious will? What behaviors do I feel ashamed of after they occur? What aspects of myself do I hide to maintain my social image? This work requires genuine courage because it is uncomfortable to admit that you harbor anger, envy, fear, or cruelty. However, as long as you do not recognize these elements, you will continue being controlled by them unconsciously. Identifying the shadow represents only the beginning. The next step, and the most challenging, involves consciously confronting it. This requires understanding how the confrontation process actually works. Confronting the shadow, the path of conscious integration. Recognizing your shadow constitutes an essential first step, but genuine transformation occurs through direct confrontation. Here, Jung was absolutely categorical. There is no alternative to this stage if you wish to become a psychologically integrated individual. In The Undiscovered Self, he warns that individuation is not achieved by denying the shadow, but by confronting it with courage and consciousness. But what does shadow confrontation mean in practical terms? First, you must accept that this process is inherently uncomfortable and absolutely inevitable. You do not choose whether you will face your shadow. Your only choice is whether you will do so consciously or continue being unconsciously manipulated by it. When you begin bringing dark contents into conscious light, intense emotional reactions arise: guilt, shame, fear, anger. Many abandon the process here, retreating back into persona safety. However, this is precisely when the real work begins. Consider practical examples. You realize you feel envy toward colleagues who achieve success. Your initial impulse is denial or rationalization. I don't really care about that. True confrontation involves admitting without judgment that envy is present, then asking yourself, where does this emerge from? What does it reveal about my own unacknowledged frustrations and desires? Or imagine you have chronic difficulty establishing boundaries or confronting others. In shadow confrontation, you realize this pattern conceals deep fear of rejection and repressed anger about being consistently disrespected in the past. Facing this anger and accepting it as legitimate represents part of the integration process. During confrontation, you typically experience several phases. Denial, the impulse to rationalize or minimize dark aspects. Resistance, guilt or shame feelings when admitting unacceptable parts of yourself. Acceptance, conscious recognition of these aspects as legitimate parts of your psyche. Integration, gradual assimilation of these contents, reducing their autonomous power. Jung emphasized that this journey is not linear. In Aeon, he describes shadow confrontation as a continuous assimilation process that accompanies lifelong development. There is no moment when you definitively defeat the shadow. Rather, there is ongoing commitment to dialogue and integration. Practical tools for this work include dream analysis, reflective writing, Jungian psychotherapy, contemplative meditation, and above all, sincere willingness to examine yourself with brutal honesty. Be aware that during confrontation, new psychic elements emerge. Deep archetypes residing in the collective unconscious begin manifesting, playing crucial roles in this process. Understanding how these archetypes, such as the anima, animus, self, and trickster, can both accelerate and hinder shadow integration is essential knowledge. Archetypal forces in shadow integration. As you advance in shadow confrontation, something inevitable occurs. Deep archetypes from the collective unconscious begin emerging and influencing your integration process. Jung devoted extensive research to these universal patterns of behavior and symbolic imagery. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he defines archetypes as universal, inherited psychic systems that function as organizing structures of human experience. During shadow confrontation, 4 archetypes often manifest with particular intensity: the anima animus, the self, and the trickster. Each plays fundamental roles, sometimes as guides, other times as obstacles. the anima and animus. The anima represents the unconscious feminine aspect in men, while the animus represents the unconscious masculine aspect in women. These serve as intermediaries between conscious and unconscious realms. During shadow integration, these archetypes frequently emerge through dreams, emotional projections, and relationship dynamics. Practical example: a man undergoing individuation begins experiencing recurring dreams featuring mysterious feminine figures, seductive, dangerous, or wise. These images represent the anima inviting integration of repressed emotional aspects. Similarly, women may encounter dominating or inspiring masculine figures representing the animus. The self. This archetype represents psychic totality, the organizing center that transcends the ego. When the self emerges, there is usually powerful impulse toward integrating internal polarities. However, the self also confronts you with everything you have denied, demanding conscious balance. Practical example: after months of shadow work, you begin feeling new internal unity and coherence. However, this accompanies deep existential crises, questions about purpose, values, and identity. This represents the self in action, forcing internal reorganization. The trickster, perhaps the most treacherous archetype in this process. The trickster embodies deception, chaos, and rule breaking. On the individuation path, the trickster often emerges when you believe you have overcome shadow aspects. It tests your ego by creating emotional traps and illusions of superiority. Practical example: after significant progress, you begin thinking of yourself as more awakened or aware than others, ironically falling into new self-deception. The trickster is active, inflating your ego and obscuring genuine inner work. In Ion, Jung emphasizes that archetypes are not consciousness contents, but factors that organize and structure the psyche. Recognizing their presence and role is crucial for navigating individuation with clarity. Shadow integration is neither linear nor simple. With each step, these archetypes emerge to guide, test, and transform you. Learning to identify and dialogue with them represents one of the most important skills you can develop. But why endure all this challenging work? Because the result is radical transformation in your emotional strength and psychological resilience. The transformation, becoming emotionally unshakable. After everything you have learned, it is natural to question why you should undertake the difficult work of shadow integration. The answer is straightforward, because the result is profound transformation of your emotional intelligence and your capacity to navigate life's challenges. Carl Jung made this explicit in The Undiscovered Self. No transformation of consciousness can occur without parts of the unconscious, primarily the shadow, being brought into light. In other words, you cannot achieve genuine emotional maturity until you face and integrate your shadow. But what does this mean practically? Consider someone who has struggled their entire life with anger outbursts. After shadow integration, this person does not become passive or emotionally flat. Instead, they begin recognizing anger as legitimate emotion, learning to express it consciously and proportionately. This makes them emotionally stronger and more complete. Another example: a person with chronic social anxiety who previously avoided social situations due to irrational fear of judgment. Through shadow integration of aspects related to insecurity and approval seeking, they gradually begin engaging these situations with new self-confidence and authenticity. These changes occur because shadow integration allows you to reclaim dissociated parts of your psyche. This releases psychological energy previously consumed in repression. As a result, you become more authentic. You begin acting congruently with who you really are, not just maintaining a persona. More emotionally resilient. Intense emotions no longer dominate you because you recognize them as legitimate aspects of your being. Less reactive. By recognizing your triggers, you stop projecting onto others what belongs to you. More psychologically whole. You accept yourself as a complete human being with light and shadow, generating profound inner peace. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung writes, "The acceptance of the dark side of oneself strengthens the individual as they begin relating more honestly and consciously to life. People who reach this integration level become emotionally unshakable, not because they no longer experience difficult emotions, but because they are no longer controlled by them. They live with presence and stability that is rare in a world where most people still flee from their own shadows. But how do you apply this in everyday life? How do you train your perception to maintain shadow integration in daily life without falling back into old patterns? This will be the focus of our next section. Daily practices for continuous shadow integration. Shadow integration is not a one-time achievement. There is no endpoint where you can declare yourself finished. Integration is an ongoing process, and the real challenge is maintaining that awareness in your daily life. First, it is essential to cultivate constant self-observation. In Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung writes that what is not brought to consciousness continues happening as fate. This means you must train your perception to identify moments when shadow content attempts emergence through feelings of irritation, envy, fear, and self-sabotage. Here are concrete practices you can implement. Conscious internal dialogue. Begin paying attention to your automatic reactions. When you feel anger, envy, or shame, instead of suppressing these emotions, engage in internal dialogue. Ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to reveal about myself? Reflective writing. Dedicate a few minutes daily to writing about situations that provoked intense emotional reactions. Writing creates safe space to examine shadow contents and reduce their unconscious power. Dream analysis. As Jung emphasized in Man and His Symbols, dreams provide direct gateways to the unconscious. Maintain a dream journal. Observe recurring images, symbols, and characters that evoke strong emotions. These are valuable indicators of what your shadow wants to reveal. Mindfulness practice. Mindfulness practices help develop present moment awareness, allowing you to observe your patterns without identifying with them. This creates space between impulse and reaction, which is essential for shadow integration. Relationship laboratory. Use your relationships as laboratories for integration. Whenever you feel strong dislike, blind admiration, or moral judgment about someone, investigate. Does this reveal something I do not accept in myself? Boundary establishment. Learning to say no and establish healthy boundaries is essential practice for integration. Many shadow contents arise when you consistently violate yourself to please others or fit in. Periodic persona review. Regularly ask yourself, what parts of me am I trying to hide behind my current persona? What aspects of my identity am I sacrificing to maintain social image? Implementing these practices does not mean you will never again be caught off guard by shadow content. It means that when it happens, you will be better prepared to handle it consciously rather than being overwhelmed. With each cycle of awareness, the shadow's power over you diminishes, while your emotional intelligence strengthens. You become more authentic, whole, and psychologically free. However, remember that this path requires continuous commitment. The shadow is cunning and adaptive, finding new ways to hide. Therefore, integration work is a lifelong process, the point of no return. Why shadow mastery changes everything. Mastering your shadow represents a point of no return, and this must be absolutely clear. Once you begin bringing the dark aspects of your psyche into light, the emotions you avoided feeling, the thoughts you denied having, the impulses you deemed unacceptable, you can no longer pretend ignorance. The comfortable illusion that you are purely a being of light, a fundamentally good person who has transcended their weaknesses, crumbles completely. What emerges instead is not perfection, but something far more powerful. The truth of being a whole human being capable of recognizing their shadows, and precisely because of that recognition, becoming genuinely free. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The function of the shadow is to compensate for the one-sided attitude of consciousness. Its assimilation leads to psychic balance that cannot be achieved by any other means." In other words, without this work, you remain unbalanced, vulnerable to unconscious impulses that sabotage your life. Ignoring the shadow carries an extremely high price. You may attempt to continue living behind your persona, projecting your fears onto others, judging what you cannot accept in yourself, fleeing from uncomfortable emotions. But the cost will be ongoing psychological suffering, chronic anxiety, depression, compulsions, toxic relationship patterns. All of this thrives in the darkness of the unintegrated shadow. Conversely, those who engage this process seriously experience profound transformation. You become emotionally resilient. You become less manipulable by others and by your own emotions. You begin acting with greater authenticity and integrity. You gain inner peace that does not depend on external approval. You learn to use even the dark aspects of your psyche as sources of strength and creativity. But do not be deceived. This does not mean you ever complete the work. As Jung pointed out in Ion, shadow integration is a process that accompanies personality development throughout life. New layers will emerge as you evolve, and the more you grow, the more capable you become of facing these new layers with courage and maturity. This is not a path for the weak or uncommitted. It is for those who want to live consciously, for those who prefer truth over comfort, for those who understand that emotional freedom is only possible when you accept all of your humanity, not just the parts you would like to show the world. Therefore, this journey represents more than self-improvement. It represents psychological revolution. When you master your shadow, you master the unconscious forces that have been secretly directing your life. You become the author of your own psychological story rather than its unconscious victim. The choice is yours. Continue living at the mercy of unconscious patterns, or begin the courageous work of becoming psychologically whole. But understand that once you truly see your shadow, you cannot unsee it. Once you taste genuine psychological freedom, you cannot return to unconscious slavery. Now I want you to make a commitment to this process. In the comments write, "I choose to face my shadow consciously." Simply putting this into words represents a symbolic and powerful first step in affirming your intention to continue this transformative path. If this comprehensive course resonated with you, do not stop here. Continue to the next video on the channel. It represents an important continuation of your journey, and will complement what you learned today. Your shadow will not disappear, but you can become greater than its unconscious influence. Now move forward with courage and consciousness,